Want to talk about hope. Now, just to clarify, we don't just mean optimism here. Not in the sort of the vague, unyielding sense that things will get better of their own accord. No, we instead want to talk about hope as the idea that things can be better if it requires a certain historical collective agency to do so, to make them happen. Better things don't happen of the course of their own accord. They have to be made to happen. And we say this quite knowingly because we know things aren't going to get better. At least not on their own accord. We can make them better, but of their own accord, they will not get better on their own. We have seen the accelerated way in which Foucault's boomerang, or as Gilles Morillon calls it, rightfully, Aimé Césaire's boomerang, has really come back to hit us, by which I mean the way in which techniques in the imperial periphery of policing, oppression, and genocide return to the imperial core. We know this from even the ideas of policing itself, which originates in the formation of the Northern Irish colonial state, the occupation of which is ongoing to this day. We have seen a genocide that is ongoing and will continue to be ongoing after this has come out, most likely. We can see all of the worst visions of child bodies, assassinated families, destroyed epistemologies, destroyed universities, destroyed communities, all scrolling at the flick of our fingers and of our desire to constantly be hooked into the circuits which show them to us. We can see what happens to people who stand up for this, both the resistance fighters themselves being assaulted by fascist genocidal soldiers and the snipers whose scopes hang over the students that dared say no to this, and even the professors whose place in the classic hierarchies will not save them from the empire's own self-defense mechanisms. We know that climate change, the effects of, are going to be worse than we predicted, or at least worse than they needed to be, although not, of course, totally destructive. We know that the politicians of parties, liberal and conservative, across the imperial core and the so-called developed West, have guaranteed this, and their main job is to prevent this new future happening. So the question is, in that sense, people say, why do we fight? We fight for a place, ultimately. We fight for our place in the world. We fight for each other's place in the world. And indeed, the paradox is that we fight for a place where we are. We fight for people around us, our communities, the global community, insofar as this shit affects all of us and is still affecting all of us. But we also fight for a place which is, in a way, like here, but good. Well, the world is not right. It's wrong. And so this place isn't here. It's here and not here. It could be here, and yet it isn't. Not yet. This world has primed us to desire this place that is both good and nowhere, here and not here. This is utopia. The world primes us to desire utopia, to want it. And what we really need going forward, insofar as we try to conceptualize and imagine how we might achieve this, fulfill this impulse, create programs based upon it, we have to be primed to think the utopian. Hope may be disappointed, as Bloch said, but this is the challenge. Optimism can only basically be destroyed. It's not a thing that can be refuted insofar as it is a striving that simply does not take in the conditions that determine it. And so today, we want to talk about hope, not optimism. We talk about how we get to the good place, or how do we start thinking about it as a real historical principle. And for this, I'm delighted to be joined by John Greenaway to talk about his new book, A Primer on Utopian Philosophy, an introduction to the work of Ernst Bloch, designed, of course, by our good comrade Craig, of course, the captain of the ship Vasset Horizon, and out on the Zero Utopia series, alongside works by Rashid Emrabti and, of course, Bill Cashmore, friend of the show. John, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me back on the show. Always happy to be here.
So, if we're talking about the perils of history, the ups and downs, Bloch was a man who lived an incredibly long life. He lived to see the production of his collective works, which is quite rare from such a philosopher, especially one so prolific. Bloch saw 1917, the Russian Revolution. He saw 1939, the rise of fascism, the outbreak of World War II. He saw 1945, the end of this in the dropping of the atomic bomb and the revelation of the horrors of the Holocaust to the world at large. And of course, he saw 1961 when his own beloved East Germany, his own beloved Berlin, became split and confined within a heavily armed border. His hope was both aroused and disappointed constantly throughout his life. And I just want to ask, what do you see in Bloch that keeps him as such a persistent figure regarding this idea of hope? And what's so, I don't even want to say inspiring, but where do you think Bloch's inspiration comes from as a thinker who can think hope at both the most elated times when optimism seems certain and hope seems superfluous, and the times in which pessimism seems abundant and hope is further from the case?
Yeah. So what's interesting about Bloch is that he attempts to hope is not something that is dependent upon the subjective for Bloch. Like in a way, I think a good analog is Badiou's concept of the event, right, and the importance of fidelity to the event, right? The moment at which nothing that comes after that moment is going to be the same, precisely because of the transformative effects of it. But Bloch's is not necessarily dependent solely upon what we might call a kind of like conversion to the theology of hope. Rather, Bloch's fidelity is grounded upon a specific and distinctly philosophical set of commitments that necessarily lead into political conclusions. So, something that I talk about at the very beginning of the book is that the problem with a lot of our discourse around hope or optimism is that it tends to be grounded in a particular historical circumstance, right? Can you win an election? Is a struggle going to be successful? Is a strike going to win? All of those things are hugely important, right, for Bloch, but they are not the final ground upon which he builds this fidelity of his intellectual, political fidelity to the philosophy of hope. That's done, as I say at the start of the book, right? If you want to take hope as seriously as Bloch does, what you have to do is you have to essentially reconstruct philosophy. You can't have just your own philosophical project. You have to have a philosophical system which is I think easily comparable to all the great system builders of philosophy, right? With all of the advantages and problems that brings. But it's like, what is it that grounds his commitments is his own very rigorous philosophical understanding of what hope is and at what level hope operates. So hope is not simply a kind of subjective feeling of agency or emotion. It isn't simply a trace or spark within the ruins of culture. Hope is a kind of philosophical basis for existence. This is what he calls the spirit of utopia. This irreducible potentiality in matter itself that political defeat won't negate. And in a way, Bloch never really sort of wavered from that commitment. He gives his lecture in 61 talking about can hope be disappointed, where he says, yes, of course it can. But the disappointment of hope is not its nullification, right? If hope couldn't be disappointed, as he puts it, it wouldn't be hope at all. But from its disappointment, it learns to re-estimate the tendencies and latencies of the historical fabric that it exists within more accurately. And so Jameson has this really good point about Bloch, which I think ties into what you're saying, where if you accept Bloch's kind of hermeneutics, everywhere you look, you kind of see the same thing. He's not someone who kind of like has multiple different variations of thought. He has one thought, but it's a thought, and so it's sort of like this old it's sort of like examining a diamond, like, and turning it through every degree of its orientation to find every single facet of it. And Jameson points out that if you look at existence and you see the outworkings of utopia, wherever Bloch is turning his gaze, he's looking for the same thing, but he's looking for it as this trans-historical kind of constant of existence that has all of these multifaceted expressions. And I think it's that's the beginning of explaining how someone who saw both the 1956 speech to the Soviet Party Congress and the Russian Revolution could maintain like fidelity to the event, or what he would call the forward dawning of genuine humanity.
And to that extent, I guess a follow-up question is, why don't Marxists have a right to be pessimists in that sense? Because, as you're saying,
this is Bloch's famous, one of Bloch's very famous quotes, where he says, "A Marxist a Marxist must believe in the principle of hope. A Marxist doesn't have a right to be a pessimist." And I think it's the use of the word "right," which I think is interesting. Because right, it implies a set of kind of like entitlements or obligations under some other authority, right? So if you're given rights under the law, and so the reasoning, I think, is that this sort of what he would call pessimism is it's problematic for Bloch because it involves a kind of settling for the immediacy of facts, the immediacy of the given reality. And this is completely antithetical to Bloch's entire philosophical project. His commitment is to the notion of process, in terms of ontology, and to the necessary correlate of that is a revolutionary Marxism in politics. So you don't have a right to be a Marxist because a Marxist can never you don't have a right to be a pessimist if you're a Marxist, because to do so would mean ignoring as he borrows from Aristotle, entelechy, ignoring this idea of matter and politics as being constantly an unfolding set of processes, and instead focusing on ends. And I think sometimes people bandy around that saying as in quite banal ways, that you should be championing every single kind of like seeming moment of possible resistance. And I think that's yeah, okay, sure, fine, but like Bloch's point is really like this depends upon, as I've said elsewhere, the way that I put it is like it's about looking at and through the facts. He has this great line talking about utopia, where he says that as long as the universe is not this totally closed system, then no objection to utopia can be raised on purely factual grounds. Bloch often said, so much for the facts, right? You can throw all of these kind of like, this is just the way things are at people as you want. And Bloch will kind of go, yes, but the way that things are is not just a given and is not just a historical constant. And that's what it means to say that a Marxist doesn't have a right to be a pessimist, because to be pessimistic is to accept something as just the way it is, to give it a naturalization that Bloch would kind of very strongly kick against.
Bloch's view of pessimism to this extent really reminds me a lot of capitalist realism, but particularly in the way in which it's a stand-in for realism in general, but the affect of it isn't just a blockage, but it's in sense of imagination constraining thought and action, but it's also at the same time effective on the level of depression. It is a structurally depressive mode of being, and that depression is designed in literally socially enforced upon the mode of people thinking is in order to enforce this kind of pessimism. But more than deeper in a way than capitalist realism, there's a metaphysics here, and there's a metaphysics of the incomplete. It feels a little bit like Jean-Paul Sartre times sort of necessity of freedom, but it's as you say, it's more processual than that, and it's essentially. It seems to be tied to two things. One, a theory of time, which comes up in the category of the non-synchronous, or sometimes the not yet. So I wonder if we can unpack that. But also as well, the idea that creation. If you take the political theological category of creation, particularly the theological category, and you take it processually, not as simply the Big Bang as something that's already been and gone, then that is still an event. There is still an incompleteness, not necessarily in this Zizekian quantum sense, but it's which there's the individual that has been individuated there's so much more in reserve for them to do. And this is, I guess, it seems to connect as well to sort of Bloch's. Sorry, it's easy to get too confused. Insistence that religion is Marxism by other means. It kind of inverts this. Well, it takes on Marx's view wholeheartedly. It's a soul, the soulless world, but it takes it down to that metaphysical level. And so, can we unpack some of the stuff regarding the metaphysical aspects of the incompleteness of the universe, as you said, and also the temporal dimension?
Yeah, and let's start at the micro and work out to the macro, right? So on the micro level, this is an existential problem, right? Bloch was asked if he could sum up his philosophy when he was an old man, and he said that the best way of summing it up was, I cannot see anything from very close. You have to have distance, and that is like foundational to self-understanding. You only understand yourself at a distance. You kind of act in what he kind of quite beautifully calls the darkness of the lived moment, and it's only almost retroactively, if you want to be nostalgic, that you kind of come to understand yourself. And I think scaling outwards, this ties into what you were talking about with capitalist realism. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the concept of horizons, because Mark Fisher describes capitalist realism as a horizon. There's Jody Dean's famous book, The Communist Horizon. And Bloch is a really, in some ways, a very beautiful writer, actually, just aesthetically, a very poetic writer. And he talks about dawning horizons quite a lot. But for Bloch, the horizon always dawns forward, because he's this philosopher who is like Janus, is two-faced, is always looking back, but the focus of his gaze is always towards the future. And I think in some ways he is the kind of necessary companion for taking capitalist realism seriously and understanding, the kind of post Mark Fisher philosophical project as being necessarily utopian. The very final line of Mark's very influential book is, from a situation in which nothing is possible, suddenly anything can happen again. Like that is like a staggeringly, audaciously utopian claim. And I think a lot of the time we sort of reinscribe those horizons in our attempt to describe them. And Bloch's philosophy, which is, if people have never read, is often like loquacious and very literary and very elusive, but is desperately trying to induce new ways of thinking in the reader. So to kind of like loop back around to temporality, there are two really commonly used terms translated in English as non-synchronicity and the not yet. So the non-synchronicity, I think, is essentially a sort of metaphysical spin on uneven development. Bloch says that we do not all live in the same now. Like we think of history as this kind of finished or closed object. We think of the present as being the present everywhere. But like honestly, any moment of political division really absolutely inscribes the truth of that statement, that capitalism's attempt to universalize itself and to naturalize itself necessarily is always already incomplete. And an obvious example is looking at the conflict in Palestine, where you have music festivals by a colonizing imperial power happening at the same time as the most brutal violence that is out to quite explicitly coded to destroy kind of civilization and society, right? It's designed to kind of expel you from the present. So the non-synchronous is this idea of history being this unfinished thing. The not yet Bloch uses in a multiplicity of different ways. And the good kind of analogy is something is not yet what it already has the potential to be. So if you if you wanted to plant a seed, you would not describe the seed as a flower. Yet everything within that seed, the flower is contained within the seed. You know, the working class is not yet the class in and for itself that is the revolutionary movement, right? But all of those conditions are always present here, if not fully articulated. So there is these two terms are designed to kind of like ground a philosophy of history. It has quite a lot in common with Walter Benjamin. To ground a philosophy of history that is not, in some ways, like is not necessarily contingent, but is unfinished. History, like all of existence, is process. And what that means is that within history there are these unrealized potentials, right? And again, this is a kind of, if you think about it, this is actually quite a straightforwardly Marxist argument, but given a very distinctive metaphysical twist. Think about Marx in the 18th Brumaire talking about revolutions. What do they always do? They always reach backwards into history. Why? Because that history is not finally and in the last instance part of that smooth horizon of capitalism. There is always the incomplete within history that has radical potentials. It's why this notion of a singular history that Benjamin was immensely critical of is a criticism that Bloch could share as well.
And to that extent, I mean, one of the big interlocutors with Bloch was Lukács, and of course the thing about Bloch is he's a very romantic figure, and Lukács, of course, coins the term romantic anti-capitalism. And I guess we could probably get into the romantic in Bloch's work, because at least in terms of romanticism as a literary and philosophical genre, it does always look backwards into something that was sort of taken from us, or at least to a kind of a fallenness. But there's nothing so much as there's nothing prelapsarian about Bloch so much as he tries to take the rational kernel from that. But actually, just as something of a detour, something of an indulgence myself, one of the things I do want to ask you about is Bloch's romanticism, insofar as his influences stem from a lot of German literature, because I know you're very much researching a lot of Goethe at the moment, and I wonder if you talk about Bloch's romanticism, maybe using something like Goethe as a touching, as a jumping off point, and maybe even something like Dante as well. Because of course, if you go to John's Patreon, you can hear John read out the cantos of the Divine Comedy with commentary, and we will link that in the note.
Yeah, so I wrote something a while ago called Provisional and Early Thoughts on Goethic Marxism. I mean, which is in another way just to say like Hegelianism, right? That's what it is. And Bloch was both. Bloch was the biggest source of quotations in Bloch's work, second only to Marx's Goethe. And he was a extremely interested and not like dogmatic, but interesting Hegelian. It took a lot from Hegel's philosophy. So I'm gonna find that piece that I wrote actually, where he talks about. Yes, here we go. So Bloch is talking in The Principle of Hope about why certain objects of culture from the past retain their interest, even though we know that they were written in kind of superstructural conditions which have been superseded now in the evolution of capitalism's development. So Bloch says, these great works are not deficient as on their first day, nor glorious as on their first day, but instead they shed their deficiency and their first glory while being capable of a later glory. In fact, a final one to which they can attend. The classical element in every classicism equally stands before each age as revolutionary romanticism, i.e., as a task that points the way forward and as a solution that approaches from the future, not from the past, and itself still full of future, speaks, addresses, calls us on. But this, together with more modest things, is only the case because ideologies seen from this side are not exhausted with the false consciousness of their base, nor with the active work for their respective bases. So simply because something comes from the conditions of a reactionary base, it isn't exhausted by it, right? The great, what is it? There's a great line that he has. All cultural works have implicitly, though not always as in Goethe's Faust, explicitly a utopian background. Faust is interesting to Bloch because of this idea of overcoming, right? Unsurprisingly, for someone who comes of age in the era of expressionism in Germany, he is, as a young man, kind of formed by Dostoevsky, by Tolstoy, and by Nietzsche. In many ways, I like my big failing as a leftist is I'm not super interested in Nietzsche, but like Bloch in many ways does build on and kind of go beyond Nietzsche. And what he's interested in is this concept of like one, freedom from the conditions of the present, and two, like Bloch puts it in maybe what we would now think of slightly problematic language, but he describes Marxism as like genuine humanism for the first time. And it's like that's what you see. You see these sparks or glimmers of it in things like Goethe. And this sense of kind of like the overcoming of the limitations of the present. Why? Because there is something within you that is called into the future. So his interest in culture is honestly, I think, very valuable, because I think a lot of the time, as it's what is it that he says? Yes, here we go. There is a spirit of utopia in the final predicate of every great statement, in Strasbourg Cathedral, in the Divine Comedy, in the expectant music of Beethoven, and in the latencies of the Mass in B minor. It is in the despair which still contains an unum necessarium, even as something lost, and in the hymn to joy. There is like these unexplored potentials, and instead of like kind of merely seeding the ground because it was, emerges out of these reactionary base conditions, Bloch understands them as one, pointing to the incompleteness of the kind of capitalist revolution in history, and at the same time, making the case that all of these great aspects of culture have within them inexhaustible meaning that reveals itself anew and is necessarily concerned with futurity. Strasbourg Cathedral was not built to memorialize a past, right? It was built as an intent to move into a future. And you can go, that's baked into that's a necessarily reactionary political theological project. And Bloch would go, yes, but not exclusively, because the claim to futurity is one that is implicitly or explicitly revolutionary.
In terms of the way in which we can read history in that way or take it, it seems like in some sense there could be a kind of not so much a tension, but at least a way in which Bloch ends up reinventing aspects of historical materialism. And one of the historical objects I think that Bloch takes on a bit differently from, say, someone like Engels, for example, is going to be the German Peasants' War. Led, of course, in parts at the Battle of Auerstedt by your friend and mine, the radical preacher, apologetic preacher Thomas Müntzer. And so, for listeners, Thomas Müntzer was a radical reformer. He was a Reformation from below kind of thinker. And then that basically means, yes, revolution. Very much hostile, and of course, rightfully so, towards Martin Luther. Led the peasants at the Battle of Auerstedt, gave us the first rainbow flag under torture, confessed that his beliefs were omnia sunt communia, all things in common, and was then beheaded, and all the peasants slaughtered by the sort of reactionary princes, as if they couldn't be reactionary. But let's say, for example, Engels. Engels, for example, looks at the peasant war in Germany and is a bit more on what Bloch would call the cold stream of Marxism. He is sort of scientific in the sense that they couldn't achieve their aims because of determined historical material conditions. That determinism, hard binding there.
Yeah.
Whereas Bloch writes a book which I believe you're currently working on to some degree on Thomas Müntzer and as a revolutionary theologian. And in a way, how does Bloch's metaphysics, or his romantic metaphysics, allow him to redeem and re-energize events from history like the German Peasants' War, like Thomas Müntzer, as opposed to saying, something along the sort of very linear lines of Engels, which is they tried it, they simply couldn't have, and therefore we needed this new model in a way. How there's a redemptive element, dare I say, in Bloch's historical materialism, which of course must come from something like or at least aligned to something like Benjamin, and this redemptive element, this apocalyptic element, seems to transform historical materialism, not necessarily away from its scientific foundations, but alongside.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to stress that Bloch probably. I would be extremely shocked if he hadn't already read the Engels book and would agree with it almost completely. But at the same time, so Bloch's relationship to religion is extremely interesting. As he always said that his aim is the recuperation of the rational kernel within the irrational, and that revolution is not simply a set of historical conditions that have to be met, like a checklist in an RTS game, right? Revolutions are, and 1917 proves this for Bloch really quite handily, right? Were the determinate conditions of history ready for a successful Soviet revolution? No, absolutely not. Everything that a very sober analysis of conditions would tell you would say this isn't going to happen. But Bloch recognizes that actually, what does theology do, or what did Münzner's theology do? It spoke in the language of the future. So his problem with religion is it defers the eschaton, right? Paradise is always to come, which is good, but the future is never to arrive, right? It's always, at some point, it's always constantly deferred. And so he kind of recognizes Münzner's attempts from theological grounds or theological premises to reach political conclusions, right? By following this, his kind of messianism, his millenarianism, this idea that actually the kingdom of God is at hand, that immediately moves you from a simply abstract theology to one that is explicitly political. There's a new biography of Münzner, which is just out, which I think will well due for a Münzner revival. And it's what's extremely interesting about it is that it does something that I think Bloch would appreciate, which is theology is often thought of as very abstract, as a well, it's not real, it has no material substance, when in fact actually it's enormously motivating on a sociological level. Bloch also wrote a second book, Atheism and Christianity, which is about this explicit split between what he calls the religions, the Christianity and Christendom, or the split between the religion of the poor and the religion of the priest. And it's those two things. People who kind of go, well, all religious movements are inherently reactionary, are kind of ever so slightly missing the point, which is that there is enormous revolutionary potential within them that operates on a level that is far more powerful than simply economic determinism.
And if you want to catch up with some of the contemporary theological debates or contemporary theological thought on revolutionary and materialist applications of Christianity, please do go back to our episode with Damon Garcia on The God Who Riots, because that book, the impact is still yet to be seen. I also totally agree. Andrew Drummond's Thomas Müntzer book, if it's still out there, it's sold like hotcakes. I bought the last copy in Houseman's when I found it. We are absolutely due a Thomas Müntzer revival. I mean,
and I really
everyone from the
I really do hope that more people read Bloch's Atheism and Christianity. One, because it's very beautifully written. It's maybe one of his best books. And two, because it just kind of like negates so many of the terrible discussions on the left about religion. It just completely blows them apart. Of it being some sort of like necessary salve or inherent reaction or something that will inevitably that has nothing to do with communism, or is something that will have to necessarily be eradicated And Block goes, actually, no. The story of his great line is, the Bible has always been the church's bad conscience, and the story of the Bible is the movement from bondage into liberation. And he reads the Bible particularly explicitly in revolutionary terms, and riven with these contradictions and these tensions between the religion of the priests and the religion of the poor, or as we could put this in kind of like much more traditional terms, as a class struggle. And I should kind of point out that Block is a materialist and an atheist, but at the same time recognizes that the dream of the future is as his claim is like this utopian, the spirit of utopia, this dream of the future is a universal constant and is basically the ground for communism coming to consciousness of itself.
Oh, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, it's as you said, the way that we discuss religion, well, in leftist circles I've experienced at least, is actually no. I think we're getting better, but at least some interventions online, we have never left Hippel's Weinstube. I mean, my speciality, folks, as people probably know, is the debates of the young Hegelians in the 1840s, which was situating it all amongst the boundaries of religion. And these debates, we've been having the same ones since at least 1841. Bruno Bauer, Ludwig Feuerbach, the feces on Feuerbach. We honestly need to get them tattooed on ourselves at one point. I know, unless you want to stick to Leviticus, but get them, keep them on like embroidered somewhere, so we can get a sense that we're not doing this merely contemplative thing about whether the essence of God is the essence of man or the like. It's. I mean, what is so refreshing about Bloch? Not only, as you said, the way he writes, because atheism and Christianity, it's aphoristic. It reminds you of what I love about Nietzsche to that extent. Like if you love like Nietzsche, if you love like Minima Moralia, and you love that kind of what Cornel West would call a prophetic fire in these diagnoses of the injustices of the present, and indeed the history of radical materialist, not in the sense of everything is just hard stuff, but in the sense of challenging the social relations that dominate distribution of resources and the distribution indeed of life, death, and time itself. I think you need to go to someone like Bloch. I was about to say we're due a Bloch revival, but we're already in the middle of one. You've got one, not only one, but two books coming out on Bloch. With Bloch in it this year, and maybe as a way of sort of foreshadowing the second one, there's a phrase which I love from Bloch, which is very similar to the Cold and Ward Stream, but it's this phrase: there's two different types of being read. Not in the sense of interpreted, but in the sense of the color, of course. And what does he? Is this just the warm and the cold stream here? I mean, how does he find balances between the two? I mean, not in the sense that he doesn't achieve it, but sometimes it's so easy to be stuck in this antinomy. It's very easy to be very undialectical about the way that Marxism makes us imagine, the way that Marxism makes us know. We need to know the determinants of the situation of this, and this, and yet still, in a very dialectical manner, actually, we keep passing from one to the other. Because as Hegel says, to reach limit is to already be in some sense on the other side of it, and we keep pinging back between this, the bread and roses, the flags, the banners, and then the hard idea that we can do something, we can occupy, we can send messages out there, the things which tend to go against our harder materialist impulses, and it tears organizations, tears revolutionary thought apart, because you try to hold yourself back from this dimension, not necessarily a subjective dimension, but from the structures of feeling, let's say, to get, or maybe even, to go a bit more Raymond Williams about it. We want to hold this kind of individualistic notion of the scientist as a diagnostic, the social as a diagnostic character, whereas it's really a collective subject. I just want to get your thoughts on how Bloch passes through those.
This is why there's 20 volumes in his complete works, right? Like, I really, one of the best things about Bloch is his writing style, and you're quite right. It's often very aphoristic, and it is not necessarily a series of like logical arguments that get laid out, but you go on a kind of like cognitive, psychological journey to get through a Block book. And really, one of the if you break Block's writing down into the smallest unit, one of the kind of base units of constructing thought for Block is the and yet. You know, you can list all of the problems. You can have the best diagnosis, and yet there is always this. For Block, it is this kind of like irresistible pull towards utopia. You know, this moment where out of yourself you are kind of called into possibility, right? I talked about this when we did an event at Hausman's, which is like, that's the ground of solidarity, is the absolutely audacious gamble of, and yet, despite everything that we know, there is still these possibilities of kind of rupture. And I think the student occupations in the US are an incredibly good sign of this, right? This moment sort of like where we've been convinced of like generational political quietism, and the kind of huge delegitimizing of American state power that's happened on a generational level, is not to be kind of downplayed in the slightest, because there's these like it's been reduced to a cliche, but when you see it, solidarity genuinely is a beautiful object that has arrived from the future. Vijay Prashad uses this quote all the time: communists are refugees from the future, right? We are out of time, because the ideal future is one where it's not necessary for anyone to be a Marxist, right? Being a Marxist now is like being a doctor, right? Wouldn't it be great if we didn't need them? Wouldn't it be great if we had reached the conditions where it was no longer necessary for us to be Marxists? So we become these kind of like, we are temporally disjointed. And that carries with it these huge. There isn't really an easy way out of those antinomies, and the only way for Block is to write his way through them. It's true that like his split with Lukács, I don't want to be reductionist to either one of them, but his split with Lukács is generally about commitments to one or the other of these positions. I mean, if you read early Lukács, you can tell that Lukács was immensely influenced by Block. Like genuinely, it's very beautiful, very poetic writing. It's deeply utopian writing. And Block's interests in philosophy and in that kind of like clinical diagnostic function of Marxism is something that he picks up from Lukács. And the split is Aesthetics and Politics is the collection from Verso that collects the debate. And if you read it, like Lukács is forensic and probably wins the debate, I would say. But one always gets the sense of like Block desperately pulling his punches, because I think for Block, he rested upon this commitment of, he never writes a manifesto of what is utopia going to look like, because he saw it. He saw the Russian Revolution, and that was the thing that he held fidelity to. He was, in some ways, and I think this is why he's worth building on, he was a quite traditional Leninist. And that involves necessary contradiction. But contradiction is really the beginning of thought. It's not the end of thought, right? So if you are going to be a romantic Leninist, that's in and of itself, that's a contradiction. But it's a very productive one, right? It immediately generates new ideas and new concepts. It's sort of like calling oneself a Christian communist, right? Like intuitively, there'll be people who respond to that with, well, that doesn't make sense. That you can't be that, but you've immediately generated new possibilities just by kind of claiming it. So again, the point is process for Block, and I think it's through process that he tries to avoid these problems. As he puts it, the process will be made by the people who are made by the process. Right? There isn't a determined end for what the ideal revolutionary subject looks like. It's something that is always in the process of being worked out. But I honestly think a really good critique of Block is, despite his insistence upon process and despite his, I think, genuinely sincere commitment to that on a philosophical and political level, teleology is almost impossible to get away from. Mostly because he he does see the not yet out of communism as a real concrete possibility, right? That his teleology is the utopia is real for Block, even though utopia is not yet. And that's why I think his dialogues with Lukács are so valuable. It's why his dialogues with Adorno particularly are so valuable. Because the way out of those contradictions is not to avoid them. The way out is through and to kind of like lean back into into process rather than focusing on ends.
Focusing on contradiction it reminds me a lot of a phrase from, I can't remember his name now, but it's a book called Conversations with Goethe. And the writer of this asks Goethe at one point about his time with Hegel. And then Goethe asked Hegel to give him a one-sentence definition of dialectics. And Hegel said to him, it's the living movement of contradiction in all things. And thinking about contradiction there and the way in which contradiction, of course, the motor of dialectics explicitly means as well, this, as you're talking about with the antinomies of moving between these categories of scientist and romantic, in a way in which every category ends up transgressing itself, exceeding itself, demonstrating the limits of the other. There's a sense in which, insofar as one exceeds the other, one exceeds the category, one is a demonstration of it, that there is a kind of monstrosity to contradiction. And I wanted to move it a little bit to how this feeds into your next book, which I have here. Capitalism, A Horror Story, Gothic Marxism, and the Dark Side of Radical Imagination, out July, one of the two beginning of July.
July.
I'll put a link down to pre-orders. July, there we go. And
there we go. I should have had this in shot the whole time.
Block is heavy in this book, especially in the sort of especially in the second chapter. And how does Block, as a utopian thinker, feed into your work on the Gothic? Because in a way, the Gothic, as you say, is this history sort of out of time, and the utopian dimension is also out of time in that same way. But the Gothic is, does Block give you a way to theorize the utopianism of the Gothic?
I mean, I hope so, and that's kind of like the wager of the book. And I think maybe there are chapters that people read and they'll go, okay, that makes sense, but maybe the stuff on Block might get them to double take. So the aim is for the Gothic. The Gothic is about the dislocation of history, and in fact, it's about the fact that history is not this kind of like hermetically sealed environment, but is the dead rise from their graves to demand satisfaction. They demand our acknowledgement, and by doing so, they even if only implicitly, they raise the question of the future. I think Block is definitely the kind of heaviest presence, but I think again the correlate in this intellectual constellation is Benjamin, right? Even the dead will not be safe, right? As he puts it in on the philosophy of history, and it's like the idea of a Gothic Marxism is about not only understanding the incompleteness of history and in fact the plurality of histories, but the necessary redemption of the suffering of history in a utopian future. And if there is a utopia, it has to and must include the monster which capitalist history has sought to expel. So the example that I use quite a lot in the book is Frankenstein's creature. And what Frankenstein's creature is, as I kind of talk about in the book, it is is the body of the working class and the poor. It's literally stitched together remains of the unmourned and unremarkable dead that comes to consciousness of itself and its ability to demand recognition in ways which I think are kind of profoundly politically powerful, right? And it's not a surprise that Frankenstein's creature became a political metaphor in the 19th century. The 19th century being the age of the riot strike, right? The prefigurative moment of like the strike as a weapon of class war was these kind of riots and strikes of the 19th century. So I think Bloch is useful in bringing us back to the kind of haunted nature of history. So I think it's Hannah Proctor has a really good book out called on burnout, as a kind of like response to political defeat. And one of the final chapters of the book is about ghosts. The Gothic is full of ghosts, and ghosts are necessarily, and I think almost always about loss. Ghosts are deeply melancholic, and they are in some way utopian signals of what could and perhaps even should have been. But it was something that was cut off, but is not entirely gone because we are haunted by it. And this is why I think Bloch connects so well to to Mark Fisher and to hauntology and to like our current political situation, because particularly his work on acid communism and Ghosts of My Life, there's this idea of that we're haunted by something, but this is not horrifying, right? It's a sign of what we've lost. And Bloch is very attuned as a philosopher. He's very attuned to minutiae, to things like, what do you daydream about? What are you hungry for? What do you feel like is missing existentially? All of those things are not simply records of defeat, but they are also, and often implicitly and often inchoately, in a kind of like flickering sense, they're also these signs of what could be in the future. So this is why the book starts with Frankenstein and it ends with kind of contemporary Britain. I won't say too much about the conclusion because I'd like people to go and buy the book. But the point is, like, if there is a utopia, it has to begin with and kind of flow from that which capitalism hates and fears. And what it's always hated and feared is a revolutionary working class, right? Utopia is it has within it the potential to be a universal kind of construct, but I think increasingly, as I've thought about it, utopia is not universal, because there will be those who see utopia as horrifying and reject it, precisely because it would involve them losing too much to be a part of.
Well, it's not their utopia, as you point out, the China Miéville likes to say, and if you want to counterpose utopia and monstrosity, I really do. I do wonder if it works to say that whereas utopia is the not yet for Bloch, monstrosity is the and yet, in the sense of, capital has been uninterrupted in its course of world domination ever since the fall of Berlin Wall, and possibly even before then, depending on how you read it. Let's not get into that. But defeat after defeat after defeat, and yet people are still, and yet we are still here. People are still propelled by their material needs, by oppression, to stand up against it, and that requires thinking. I don't want to say thinking otherwise. Otherwise, it sometimes gets a bit null, but no, thinking competent, thinking the real movement that abolishes the state of things and replace it with what? We don't know, but we know it's better than this.
Yeah,
and we can't know it's better than this until we start theorizing that desire. I mean, would you say that Bloch is that sense of a theorist of desire? And we haven't spoken much about, we've spoken about sort of dialectics and getting away from the subjective elements, but is Bloch a theorist of desire? Is hope inextricably tied with desire, or does the metaphysical element take it away from that, or does he metaphysicalize desire in that sense? Because even if
all the way down,
we might not want utopia, and yet it's possible.
Yes, absolutely. He is intensely attuned to the very smallest moments of what we say or what we kind of profess to believe. I mean, he talks about folk tales. He talks about village dances, or like clubbing, or like all of these kind of like little instantiations, these little moments in which we become active agential subjects within our own life world. And Desire is very revelatory. He's very critical of Freud and Jung. He's hugely critical of them both, because he kind of points out that like we don't really know very much about ourselves. It's really the kind of science of self-knowledge, as he calls it, is like only a couple of centuries old, because Freud might have started the work, but really his whole point is that it casts us back into ourselves. And if there isn't a theory of desire within communism, then there is nothing beyond, like, materialism dries up. It becomes this arid, deterministic machine into which we kind of like are forced to kind of hurl ourselves. And again, I think Hannah Proctor's book is very good on this, because it kind of elucidates the ways in which a theory of desire is necessary to deal with the often very ambiguous emotional weight and consequence of being involved in political struggle. Because if things were simply just and the ways in which we've often split our political commitments away from the kind of like emotional life world of drives, desires, dreams, and hopes, and what it means to have a disappointed hope, often can be like hugely subjectively painful, right? And Bloch is very good on this, and actually sees like subjectivity much more in a kind of unified model. I think Bloch is often very inspirational to read, but does so in a way that is constantly trying to refer us back to something bigger than just our own feelings. Because those moments of utopianism, what he would call the Vorschein, the pre-appearance of utopia, those moments in life where you go, can't it all be like this? Those that you recognize on an almost inarticulate level. Bloch would go, yes, that's great, but that isn't enough, right? That isn't enough for us to hang our entire politics on. But there is something within you that recognizes this, and what's necessary is to politicize those moments, and to like lead people to those questions of why isn't it always like this? I think everyone has had experiences like where like all seems right with the world, as Bloch would put it, where the divide between subject and object doesn't exist anymore, and you feel kind of at home. Like, for some people it's a gig, for some people it's at a protest, for some people it's on a picket line, right there. But those have to be politicized moments, because if they're not, they become fleeting and they kind of vanish. And I think what's been really encouraging over the past I think probably the past decade or so of the global mass movement of protests is that those have been politicized moments, right? Vincent Bevan's book on this is, I think, worth kind of paying attention to, If We Burn, where what this necessitates is a return to questions of strategy and organization, but like the utopian impulse has to be to politicize those moments, to reach into the quotidian, and to kind of pry it open, and to kind of like extract from the fleeting and the subjective the universalizable rational content, which is, as you say, not some airy fairy thing of thinking differently, but is communism. It is the abolition of the present state of things. And do we know what comes after that? No, not necessarily. But that's the starting point of like connecting desire with kind of like positive revolutionary action. And his argument is quite simple, that if we don't do that, fascism will. Like political reaction will. Erbschaft dieser Zeit, Heritage of Our Time, is all about this. It's all about the rise of fascism in Germany, that was done not simply through like economic determinants, right? But through for a big swathe of Germany, what was promised to them? They were promised glory and power. They were promised these things which were designed to appeal to thwarted desire. and this is why like was kind of so scathing about arid materialism, because he saw that it had no real way of combating the rise of fascism. And again, I think there are loads of correlations here between Bloch's work on the role of imagination, desire, and emotion and subjectivity, with particularly Mark Fisher's work on what is it,
Mm.
what can we do on the level of the quotidian and the fleeting. It isn't sufficient, right? But it is a starting point. It's not the totality of our politics, but like if you politicize those moments, you have in slightly old-fashioned language, it's about the raising of consciousness, right? Or rather bringing consciousness to itself, to put it in perhaps more Blockian language.
No, I completely agree. In that, I think that even counts in, as you've mentioned, with those feelings at a picket or a protest, even politicizing those moments when those moments themselves are political.
Yeah,
because it's that thing that keeps you from. It's that thing that keeps it from just being catharsis. Just just doing your bits, and then I remember one of those moments that was very clear to me was sort of months and months ago. It was so every week there was a pub in London called in Honor Oak, basically, and they had drag queen story time, and every Saturday, sorry, this was a while ago, some fascists, usually led by GB News wankers, would show up and try to intimidate. And I remember once I went at one of these and vastly outnumbered, outshouted, basically eventually just legged it, scared. The police, the only thing protecting them, and the street eventually became a party. Trade unionists, communists, all different kinds of micro sects and parties, and just regular locals. And then because we were defending a pub, of course, the sacred British institution, we went to the pub afterwards. And so it was just a pub where all these families having their Sunday lunch, drag queens doing disco DJ sets. And I got me and the guys we've pulled a pint and thought, this is what acid communism's going to be like. And it won't, of course. There won't be the labour relations have the same sort of pub setup, but there will be those moments of basically a new kind of community built off by the evacuation of all of those reactionary forces from the zone, the liberation of a zone from those forces. And it's that politicization in which you can start thinking the thinkable of utopia. And I think that's just so important for you to bring it up.
The air clears for a moment, like the atmosphere changes. And it's like the thing that Bloch always says is like, we don't yet remember what we're capable of doing, right? And I think another really good example is what happened in Glasgow, where an immigration raid goes into a neighborhood,
Kemio Street,
and people lie under the van so they can't take them away, and the police surround it and run. And it's like it's such a valuable lesson, because it's a reminder. Not only is it like a beautiful act of kind of human solidarity, but it's also a reminder of like, even if you thought you had no political agency, you actually do. And so much of Bloch's work is about looking back at the culture and to history and actually into the day-to-day of our kind of lived experiences, and go, you don't remember, you don't yet remember of what you're capable. But there are memories that can be awakened, right? If it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, then the Blockian response is like, we have to work on our imagination. And also, like, good. If this has to end for the end of capitalism, fine. But he says, talking about the Bible, Genesis arrives at the end, not the beginning, right? Genesis is really where things come to a conclusion, right? But then this is where also the new that is yet to be determined comes into being. And I think the really valuable thing about Bloch, if you want to kind of rediscover the utopian tradition, is not that is that he doesn't come with this idea of like, here are your policies, here is your program, here is your party, but rather this idea of like, here is an unfolding process to which you have always been a part but unaware. And I think this is what reading this, for me anyway, is like, this is the thing about that's great about reading philosophy, is that it is kind of consciousness altering, right? Where you actually find your own perception of who you are and your own agencies and potentials and capacities fundamentally shifted. And it doesn't provide a kind of like easy answer. And actually, Bloch in his later life would actually go on to go, that answer may never arrive, but it can be fought for. And that struggle may not arrive at the place that it thought it would when the struggle commences, but the struggle will necessarily continue, because this isn't just a matter of kind of individual choice, but is one of the philosophical constants of existence. And so the primer is not supposed to be a kind of like definitive reading, but is supposed to be a passing on of something, right? Of Bloch describes history as an archive and as a weapon, and this is part of the archive. This is part of our arsenal. And if you believe in, as he puts it, Marxism as both detective and liberator, he is a kind of invaluable friend and an invaluable resource.
And on that note, I can't think of a better place to wrap things up and then send people off to buy a primer on utopian philosophy. Look at that beautiful pre-Raphaelite design, lovingly put together by Craig. And of course, if you have the inclination to buy this, why don't you buy the Gothic expansion pack, the DLC? Why don't you pre-order John's next book, Capitalism: A Horror Story, which you can get via Repeater? Just double checking, Zero Repeater. It's a Repeater channel, but they're different websites. But you can get both. And of course, we will have John back for a panel on Gothic Marxism when that comes out too. There is far too much goth to be left for a single session. John, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at the Liquor Guy. Thehaunt.blog is where I blog, not nearly as often as I would like. If you would like to come and listen to a podcast which is about the three most important things, it's about friendship, communism, and occasionally scary films, you can listen to Horror Vanguard wherever you get your podcasts from. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.